Get into a lot of things swirling around this Indiana Fever team and situation, man. Cheryl Reeve exposing, flat out exposing Stephanie White once again. This
Let me tell you something. What you just watched right there, that is not a coaching moment. That is a symptom. That is the visual evidence of a situation that has been festering inside that Indiana Fever locker room, boiling under the surface every single game, and it finally exploded on national television for the entire basketball world to see. And the most dangerous part? The people running that franchise still haven't done a single meaningful thing about it. Welcome to Street Hoops. I'm Dre Fiver, and today we are going all the way in on this Stephanie White situation. Because, folks, the receipts are piling up, the comparisons are damning, and the excuses have officially run out. Let's start with the game itself, because context matters more than people realize. The Indiana Fever traveled to Portland on May 31st, 2026, and got straight up embarrassed by an expansion team. Let that sink in for a second. An expansion team. The Portland Fire, a brand new franchise that didn't exist a year ago, dropped a season-high 100 points on what is supposed to be one of the premier organizations in the entire WNBA. The final score was 100-84, and it wasn't even that close for most of the night. Portland led 50-37 at halftime, and the Fever couldn't cut the deficit to less than 13 points at any moment in the entire second half. That is not a team that got unlucky. That is not a team that hit a cold shooting night and got caught. That is a team that got outcoached and outworked by a roster that was assembled from scratch. And that reality should shake everyone inside that organization to the core. Right at the center of this catastrophe was Caitlin Clark, who was held to a season-low 6 points on 1 for 7 shooting and played only 22 minutes because of foul trouble, picking up her 5th personal foul in the final minute of the third quarter. Now here is the thing, Clark struggling is a story on its own. Yes, but Clark struggling because the defensive scheme her own coach is running leaves her completely exposed on every single possession. That is a fundamentally different conversation. That is not a player failing. That is a coaching failure dressed up as a player failure. And Dre Fiver is not going to let that distinction slide by without calling it out directly. Teams have been targeting Clark in isolation all season long, running quick downhill guards directly at her, forcing contact, getting her into foul trouble early, and limiting her impact in ways that have become almost embarrassingly predictable at this point. It is not a secret. It is not some genius scheme that opposing coaches cooked up overnight. Multiple teams have now executed this same exact game plan against the Fever, and it has worked every single time. The Golden State Valkyries did it. The Portland Fire did it back to back. And the reason it keeps working is not just because Clark has defensive limitations. Every player in this league has limitations. It is because Stephanie White has not made the schematic adjustments necessary to protect her. Franchise player from a vulnerability that the entire league has now. Scouted, filmed, and weaponized. When your best player is getting hunted in one-on-one situations play after play, and your answer as a head coach is to keep her on the floor in the same broken defensive structure until she fouls out, you have failed at the most basic responsibility of your job. Indiana leads all teams in the league in offensive scoring, averaging nearly 92 points per game. Think about what that number tells you about Caitlin Clark's offensive impact, the gravity she creates, the spacing she generates, the records she is continuing to rewrite. And then look at what's happening defensively, where the Fever are allowing nearly 89 points per game, which ranks as the second worst defensive mark in the entire league. All of that offensive firepower is being systematically canceled out by a defense that teams have figured out how to exploit. The Fever have been blown out 3 times this season, and every single one of those blowouts comes back to the same defensive breakdowns, the same mismatches, the same unaddressed structural problems that Stephanie White has not fixed. And then comes the timeout. The moment that broke the internet and sent every analyst, every fan account, every podcast in basketball culture into full meltdown mode. During the Portland loss, Stephanie White was captured on camera in a huddle addressing the team with Clark sitting directly in front of her. White was visibly animated, jabbing her finger in Clark's direction, and the exchange clearly escalated to the point where White called rookie Raven Johnson over and sat Clark down on the bench. In front of teammates, in front of cameras, on a nationally broadcast game. Afterward, White addressed it head-on, saying what happened in that moment was simply coaching, challenging a player, and that it wouldn't even be a story in a men's basketball environment. And Clark, to her absolute credit, handled it with class, saying the team was down 20 points, that frustration was understandable, and that it was on her to be better. She even went as far as saying she rides for Steph, and that people in the media want to blow things up into something they're not in reality. Dre's personal opinion? Clark is telling the truth about what she believes in that moment, and I respect that. I genuinely do. A player protecting her coach publicly takes discipline and maturity, and Clark showed both. But here is what I also know from watching basketball at every level for my entire life. Players protect their coaches publicly until the environment makes it impossible to keep doing so. And the fact that we are 8 games into the 2026 WNBA season, sitting at 4-4, and we are already having this conversation about the relationship between the franchise player and the head coach, that is not a good sign. That is not noise. That is a signal. WNBA royalty weighed in on the situation, and their takes were revealing in ways that went beyond the surface-level analysis. Cheryl Miller came out and said plainly that what she is seeing in Indianapolis is frustration boiling over and being seen publicly, and that there is a significant difference between having it behind closed doors versus having it spill onto the court with cameras rolling. She raised the real question, not whether the confrontation was justified or not, but whether these two people can continue to coexist in this environment. And that is the right question. That is the question everybody should be asking. Sue Bird, who played the better part of 2 decades at the highest level of this sport and dealt with coaching dynamics of every variety, added genuine substance by walking through exactly how she addressed her own defensive limitations when opposing teams tried to hunt her in isolation. Her solution was complete film study, learning every tendency of every player she would guard so thoroughly that she could dictate the matchup before it even developed. That is championship wisdom. That is exactly the kind of specific, actionable guidance that can help Clark grow through this. And the irony is that a Hall of Famer had to go on a national broadcast to deliver the defensive coaching tips that Caitlin Clark's own head coach should be implementing inside the practice facility every single day. Now, let's talk about the media circus that erupted around this situation, because the Skip Bayless episode is almost too perfect as a case study in how the modern sports media ecosystem operates. Bayless, a longtime sports commentator who has been in this industry long enough to know better, jumped on social media and posted that Stephanie White was reportedly out as head coach of the Indiana Fever after repeated in-game clashes with Caitlin Clark. He went further, suggesting that Clark wanted her former Iowa coach Jan Jensen to take over, and that White's days were numbered regardless of whether her frustrations with Clark were valid. The post went absolutely nuclear. Every basketball account on the platform was sharing it within minutes. The clicks were real, the engagement was real. There was just one problem. The report itself was not real. According to the Indiana Fever's own beat reporters, the claim had absolutely no validity. Bayless appears to have picked up his information from a known troll account on social media that regularly fabricates Fever news for engagement, and he ran with it without doing the 30 seconds of verification that would have saved him the embarrassment. Beat reporter Chloe Peterson of the Indianapolis Star came out immediately and confirmed that Stephanie White had not been fired and remained the head coach in Indiana. Other reporters at major outlets echoed the same thing, and yet Bayless, rather than issuing a straightforward correction, essentially pivoted to saying that even if the specific report was wrong, the underlying point stands. White won't last much longer, clashing with Clark in the way she has been. Dre Fiver's take on this whole sequence? Bayless got the specific facts completely wrong, but the instinct underneath the take? That part is not nearly as crazy as his critics want to pretend. This situation has an expiration date, whether anyone wants to acknowledge it publicly or not. But here is what the entire debate about whether White gets fired or doesn't get fired is missing. Here is the conversation that should actually be driving this narrative, and it is the comparison that has been unfolding in slow motion right in front of everybody's eyes all season long. While Indiana has been burning, while the Fever's defensive scheme has been getting picked apart, while the relationship between Clark and White has been generating the wrong kind of viral moments, there has been a woman in Minneapolis quietly giving everyone in the league a masterclass in exactly how you handle a young superstar point guard. Her name is Cheryl Reeve. And over the past month, she has been silently, methodically, and devastatingly exposing every single thing that is wrong with how Stephanie White is running this Indiana Fever operation. Here is the situation Reeve inherited heading into 2026. Her best player, Nafisa Collier, the reigning Defensive Player of the Year and one of the most complete players in the league, is sidelined after ankle surgery. 5 of the top 8 players from last year's team are gone. The roster has been rebuilt almost from scratch around a second overall draft pick who has never played a professional game. Any reasonable coaching observer would have looked at the Minnesota Lynx heading into this season and said this is a development year, a transitional year, a year to manage expectations and build toward the future. Cheryl Reeve looked at that same situation and said we are going to compete for a championship right now. And through the first several weeks of the season, the Lynx have been doing exactly that, sitting at the top of the Western Conference with a winning record that nobody predicted. The difference maker is Olivia Miles. But the real story is not Miles, it is how Reeve has built a system around Miles that maximizes every gift while managing every limitation. Reeve has said publicly that Miles has a pause and burst that is genuinely rare, that she plays with her eyes in a way that is unlike anything Reeve has seen in her 17 years as a head coach, and that her ability to manipulate defenders creates opportunities for her teammates that most point guards simply cannot generate. That is a head coach publicly investing in her young star, building the narrative around her, creating the cultural foundation that a player needs to succeed at the highest level. And Miles has responded by putting up numbers that put her in historic company through her first games as a professional. But here is the coaching detail that matters most when you're comparing what Reeve is doing to what White is doing. Reeve does not run a defensive scheme that leaves her young point guard isolated in mismatches. She does not switch everything regardless of the size differential and personnel mismatch it creates. She plays help defense. She rotates. She gives her guards safety valves so that when an opposing team tries to exploit a size disadvantage or a speed advantage, there is always another body coming to assist. When a screen is set, there are two players on the ball and a third rotating from the weak side to pick up the skip pass. Courtney Williams bumps Angel Reese before she can seal her position on the block. Olivia Miles slides from the corner to the paint to create the rotation that covers the drive. That is team defense. That is how you protect a point guard without hiding her and without sacrificing your overall defensive identity. And then look at what Indiana is doing. Stephanie White wants to switch 1 through 5 on every single screen action, regardless of the mismatch it creates. That means a 5'9" guard potentially ends up on a 6'6" center in the post. That means Aaliyah Boston, one of the best post players in this league, gets dragged out to the three-point line to chase a quick perimeter guard in space. That means Caitlin Clark, who already struggles to defend in isolation situations, gets put into the exact worst-case scenario on every single possession because there is no help coming, no rotation built into the scheme, no safety net. Switch everything is a legitimate defensive philosophy when you have the right personnel, long, versatile, multi-positional players who can guard 1 through 5 in space. Indiana does not have that roster. They never have had that roster. And continuing to run a scheme that does not fit your personnel because you are philosophically committed to it is not coaching. That is stubbornness. And stubbornness is costing this team games. Dre's personal opinion here is as direct as it gets. The Cheryl Reeve and Stephanie White comparison is not even close right now. It is not a debate. Reeve took a decimated roster, protected her young stars' limitations, built a winning culture from day one, and is sitting at the top of the conference. White took a healthy roster built around one of the most talented players in the history of this sport, deployed a defensive scheme that turns that player into a liability, and is sitting at 4-4 with a viral confrontation on her resume 8 games into the season. One of those outcomes represents elite head coaching. The other one represents a fundamental misalignment between the coach and the environment she is operating in. Now look, here is something Dre is going to give you straight, because this show does not do cheap narratives. Stephanie White is not a bad basketball coach. Let me be clear about that. In 2025, without a healthy Caitlin Clark for significant stretches of the season, she took Indiana to a 24-20 record and made an underdog run all the way to the WNBA semifinals. That took real coaching. That took real tactical intelligence and the ability to get a roster to compete above its talent level in a playoff environment. That is on her resume, and it is not going away. So this is not a story about a coach who has no business being in this league. This is a story about a coach who built credibility on last year's accomplishments and is now in a situation where the bar has been raised, the scrutiny has intensified, and the performance is not matching the moment. Because here is the reality of what the Indiana Fever actually are in 2026. This is not a team in transition. This is not a team building towards something. This is supposed to be the year. Caitlin Clark is healthy heading into the season. The roster has been upgraded. The expectation from ownership, from the fan base, from the media universe that has built itself around everything Clark does, is that Indiana competes for a championship this season. That is the mandate. That is the standard. And a 4-4 record with a 16-point blowout loss to a first-year expansion franchise and a viral sideline confrontation does not meet that standard. Not even close. And the substitution pattern against Portland deserves its own examination because it tells you something critical about the communication gap between White and her star player. With 6.5 minutes left in the first quarter, while Indiana was actually leading the game, White pulled Clark, Lexi Hull, and Aaliyah Boston off the floor simultaneously. All three of them. In the first quarter, Portland immediately went on a massive run, outscoring Indiana by 14 points in the remainder of the frame to take a lead they would never relinquish. White explained afterward that she was simply managing her stars' workloads proactively, that it was nothing out of the ordinary. But here is the question Dre Fiver needs answered. If the substitution was ordinary and nothing was wrong, why did it directly trigger the sequence of events that determined the outcome of a basketball game? You cannot pull your three best players simultaneously in the first quarter of a game you're supposed to win and then explain it away as routine roster management when the result is a 14-point swing that breaks the contest. Open. The timing was wrong. The communication was wrong. And the result was wrong. The broader organizational conversation here cannot be avoided either, because this is not purely a Stephanie White problem. The Indiana Fever as a front office operation has made decisions over the past couple of years that have collectively created the environment we're watching implode right now. The roster construction has never fully addressed the defensive personnel problem. The culture around Caitlin Clark, the public face of the entire WNBA renaissance, has always felt reactive rather than proactive, responding to controversies and criticisms as they emerge, rather than building the kind of stable, insulated winning environment that protects a franchise player from external noise and internal friction. And now you have a situation where fake news reports about a coach being fired are generating more engagement than the actual basketball games, and that is a sign of an organization that has lost control of its own narrative. What Cheryl Reeve has done in Minnesota is not just about X's and O's, it is about culture. It is about the relationship she has built with Olivia Miles that allows her to yell at her in a preseason game and have Miles come out publicly and say she loves it. She doesn't think Reeve is as tough as people make her out to be, and that it all depends on how you respond to hard coaching. That is a player who trusts her coach completely. That is a player who understands that the criticism is investment, not attack. That is a player who knows the system is built to help her succeed, not expose her. Compare that to what Clark's body language has been communicating on that Portland sideline, and you understand in one image why the same type of player-coach dynamic is producing completely different results in two different cities. The solution is not complicated, and Dre is going to lay it out plainly. If Stephanie White wants to survive this season and this situation, she has to do three things, and she has to do them immediately. First, she has to change the defensive scheme to protect Clark. Not completely overhaul the system, but make the targeted adjustments, the help rotations, the hedge and recover principles, the specific game plans to keep Clark out of one-on-one isolation situations that are drawing fouls and limiting her minutes. Second, she has to rebuild the public trust with her franchise player in a way that comes through on camera, not just in the locker room. The optics of this situation matter enormously when you are coaching the most watched player in the sport. And third, she has to start winning the games that matter. Because ultimately, in professional sports, the scoreboard covers a multitude of sins. Win games, and the confrontation in Portland becomes a footnote. Lose games, and it becomes the defining image of your tenure. The Indiana Fever ownership group needs to be watching all of this very closely because the window to course correct is not open forever. Caitlin Clark's prime years are happening right now. The WNBA's explosive growth in viewership, attendance, and media rights value is happening right now. The opportunity to build a championship team around the greatest player this league has seen in a generation is right in front of them. And all of it, every bit of it, is at risk if the organization cannot find a way to create the stable, functional, winning environment that maximizes what Clark brings to the table. Cheryl Reeve is showing the entire league what that looks like. She is putting on a clinic every single game in Minneapolis, building a winner from nothing, developing a young star into something historic, and doing it all without a single viral sideline confrontation or fake news cycle about whether she is getting fired. That is the standard. That is what elite coaching looks like in this league in 2026. And until Indiana can produce something that looks even remotely similar, this conversation is not going anywhere. Dre Fiver's final word on everything we just broke down today. Skip Bayless ran with a fabricated report, but the instinct underneath that take was not wrong. This situation between Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark has an expiration date. Whether it gets resolved by White making the necessary adjustments, by the front office stepping in to change the dynamic, or by a more drastic roster or coaching move down the line, something has to give. The Indiana Fever organization has assembled one of the most marketable, gifted, and culturally significant players in the history of women's basketball. And right now, 8 games into what was supposed to be a championship season, they are watching that player get into sideline confrontations on national television while losing blowouts to expansion teams, while their defensive scheme turns her into a liability, while a coach in Minneapolis is being held up as the example of everything Indiana is not doing. That is the story. That is the real story. Underneath all the noise and the fake reports and the social media meltdowns, fix it or face the consequences. Because the clock is ticking, and the league is not going to wait for Indiana to figure this out. That is a wrap for today on Street Hoops, and I need every single one of you to get loud in those comments right now. Is Stephanie White on her way out? Does Caitlin Clark ask for a trade before this season is over? Is the Cheryl Reeve comparison the most damning coaching indictment we have seen in the WNBA in years? Drop every take you have got. Go all the way in. I want to read every single one. If you are not already subscribed to Street Hoops, you are genuinely missing out. Hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like button, and share this video with every basketball fan you know. We are on this Indiana Fever story every single day until something changes. Street Hoops, Dre Fiver, let's go.